Jason Reed had never planned to be a warrior against the system. His dream had always been simple: to graduate in law, secure a good job, and give his mother a worry-free life. But life has the nasty habit of changing plans without warning. It was 2019, and Jason, who once walked the halls of Howard University, now spent his days running between endless shifts as a grocery clerk and a night delivery driver. Since the sudden death of his father, every cent he earned went towards sustaining the household and paying for Rosa Reed's medications, his mother, who battled debilitating arthritis and a fragile heart. He never complained. Hard work had never scared him. But that morning, when he arrived home exhausted, he found a yellow envelope taped to the door, a notice of eviction. The paper trembled in his hands as he read the cold, direct words. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings, alleging non-payment. But that didn't make sense. His mother had always been meticulous with the bills. Jason dropped his backpack on the floor and ran inside. Rosa was in the kitchen, trying to reach a jar of medicine from the shelf. "Mom," he said, trying to keep his composure, "are you sure you paid the mortgage?" Her eyes filled with worry. "Of course, son. I did everything right." But Jason knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Jason gathered every bill and receipt he could find. He flipped through the papers as if searching for a magical answer. The bank statements showed that the payments had been made, yet somehow Jefferson First Bank claimed otherwise. He knew he couldn't waste time. With the eviction notice in hand, he put on his jacket and hurried to the nearest branch. The biting cold of Washington, D.C. made his fingers hurt, but the urgency kept him moving. He wouldn't let his mother be left without a roof over her head. The bank was an imposing building of glass and steel, reflecting the bustling city around it. Inside, the artificial warmth contrasted with the coldness of the employees. Jason approached the counter, trying to control his anger. "I need to speak with someone about an error in the mortgage payment," he said, showing the documents. The clerk gave him an uninterested look and typed into the system. Minutes later, a man in a grey blazer appeared, Linda McFadden, the manager. Her smile was rehearsed, too professional to be genuine. "Mr. Reed, there is no error. There simply weren't enough funds in the account." Jason took a deep breath, trying to contain his frustration. He pointed to the bank statements he had brought, each showing that the payments had been processed. "The funds were there," he said firmly. "My mother made the payments. I have the receipts." But Linda McFadden didn't even glance at the papers. With an impatient sigh, she folded her arms and replied in that dry, mechanical tone Jason had heard before from indifferent bank employees. "If there was an error, it wasn't ours. Perhaps your mother got confused, but the decision has already been made." Jason felt indignation burning inside him. He knew his mother hadn't been confused. Rosa Reed was meticulous, especially when it came to the home she had lived in for more than 30 years. But there, in front of that woman who treated him like just another number, Jason realized that arguing would be futile. He gathered the documents back, not hiding his hard look. If they didn't want to help him, he would find another way. Jason left the bank feeling the street's cold bite even more sharply. His muscles were tense, and his mind was racing 1,000 miles an hour. He took his cell phone and started searching for lawyers specialized in foreclosures, but the prices were absurd. There was no chance of affording one, not when he barely managed to cover his mother's medical expenses. He needed free help, something that seemed viable. After a few minutes of searching, he found a legal aid office for low-income people. Without a second thought, he caught a bus and went straight there. The office was in a small building wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop. Upon entering, Jason noticed the place was crowded. People with tired, worried expressions clutched papers in their hands, waiting their turn. He took a number ticket and sat down. Time seemed to drag as he watched each case being called. An elderly woman argued with a clerk about an eviction order. A sweaty, lost-looking man tried to explain an issue with his Social Security. When his name was finally called, he approached a simple desk where a middle-aged lawyer with worn-out glasses and a scruffy beard was reviewing documents. "Jason Reed?" the man asked without looking up from the paper before him. Jason confirmed and sat down, placing his stack of papers on the desk. The lawyer flipped through the documents slowly, frowning at times and letting out small sighs. Jason waited, anxious, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the man removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Look, kid, I've seen many cases like this. What you're facing isn't new." Jason leaned forward, waiting for a solution, but the lawyer just shook his head. "The problem is that fighting a bank like Jefferson First without an experienced lawyer is nearly impossible. They have an entire team just to handle these kinds of disputes. You might try, but it'll be like hitting a concrete wall." Jason clenched his fists on the desk. He had expected to hear something like that, but it didn't make the reality any less frustrating. "So that's it? They can just take my mother's house, even with the payments made, and no one can do anything?" The lawyer sighed. "You can file a motion to try to stop the foreclosure, but without a lawyer to draft it properly, it's very likely to be denied. If you really want to pursue this, I can refer you to someone who might take the case pro bono, but even those lawyers are overwhelmed." Jason took the business card the lawyer handed him, but he already knew what he would do. He had no time to wait for the goodwill of the system. If no one was going to help him, he would learn how to fight on his own. Jason left the legal aid office with the lawyer's card clenched between his fingers, already knowing he couldn't wait for anyone. The system didn't work for people like him and his mother. If he wanted justice, he would have to seek it with his own hands. The biting cold of Washington now seemed even crueler, but his mind was focused. He needed a plan. Before heading home, he made a detour to a used bookstore in downtown. The smell of old paper and reheated coffee enveloped him as soon as he entered. He walked to the law section and began pulling books off the shelves. Foreclosure defense, real estate fraud, civil litigation, titles that seemed like enormous challenges, but that now were his only hope. With a stack of heavy books in his arms, Jason walked to the counter. The clerk, a slim man with a light beard and deep-set eyes, looked at him with curiosity. "Setting up a law office?" he joked. Jason forced a smile. "Something like that." He paid with the few dollars he had and left, feeling the weight of the knowledge he needed to acquire as quickly as possible. On the bus ride home, he began leafing through one of the books, underlining passages with a pen he found in his pocket. His brain was tired, his body exhausted, but he had no choice. If the system wanted him to stay down, then it was time to learn the rules of the game and fight on his own terms. When he arrived home, Jason found his mother sitting on the couch, her gaze lost on the turned-off television screen. The silence in the room seemed heavier than ever. He placed the books on the coffee table and sat next to her. "Son, you don't have to wear yourself out with this." "We'll find a way," Rosa said, her voice tired but full of sweetness. Jason gently took her hand. "Mom, they're lying. I know they are, and if no one is going to fight for us, then I will." That night, Jason spent the entire night immersed in the books. Time seemed non-existent as he scribbled notes in an old notebook, trying to understand every legal term, every loophole, every possibility. The kitchen table turned into a battlefield, pages scattered about, sticky notes pasted on the edges of books, cold coffee forgotten beside the open laptop. He found a sliver of hope while reading about fraud in foreclosures. Something caught his attention. Any procedural error, however small, could be used to challenge the legality of the eviction. It was then that he decided to review all of the bank's paperwork, every signature, every date. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. At 3 a.m, Jason's eyes were burning, but he refused to stop. He compared the bank's documents with his mother's medical records when something caught his eye. The foreclosure notice included a signature supposedly hers, dated during a period when Rosa had been hospitalized. His heart raced. He gathered the papers and examined them more closely. It wasn't just a similar signature, it was a clumsy attempt at forgery. Moreover, the notary who had signed the document had had a license that had expired months before. Jason felt a mix of shock and anger. This wasn't merely an administrative error, it was fraud. The exhaustion vanished in an instant. Jason grabbed his cell phone and began researching similar cases. The more he read, the more he realized that this was not an isolated incident. Banks and law firms had been using illegal tactics to take homes from minorities for years, banking on the fact that few had the knowledge or resources to fight back. But he wasn't just anyone. He might not be a qualified lawyer, but he knew he had something solid in his hands. With this new discovery, Jason decided that the first thing he would do at dawn was to file an emergency motion to halt the foreclosure process. If they thought he would give up without a fight, they were about to be surprised. The sun hadn't even risen when Jason got up from his chair, his muscles stiff from hours of sitting. He rubbed his face, feeling the weight of a sleepless night, but adrenaline kept him standing. On the court's website, he found a template for an emergency motion to stop the foreclosure process. The document seemed simple at first glance, but the legal terms were intimidating. He went back to his books, double-checked every detail, and began to write. His hands trembled with fatigue, but he continued. It was the only chance to save his mother's house, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. A few hours later, with the printed motion and every piece of supporting evidence attached, Jason hurried out to the courthouse. The journey seemed endless, but he kept his focus. Upon arrival, he passed through a metal detector and proceeded to the filing office. The bureaucratic environment was stifling, with apathetic clerks and stacks of papers on the desks. He handed the documents to a woman who, without even looking up, stamped the pages. Jason held his breath as she stamped them. Processed. Now it's up to the judge to review, she said. Jason thanked her and left, feeling a small relief. It was only the beginning, but at least now he was in the game. Jason returned home with a mix of anxiety and hope. He knew that emergency motions could be reviewed quickly, but he also understood that it wouldn't be that simple. The judicial system didn't favor people like him. A young man without a degree, without a lawyer, and without connections. Even so, he had something many did not, concrete evidence of fraud. All he could do now was wait for the court's response. But waiting had never been his strong suit. Unable to sit still, he decided to continue investigating, searching for similar cases and studying judicial decisions that might serve as precedents for his defense. The next morning, the phone rang. Jason answered on the first ring, his heart pounding. "Mr. Reed," the formal voice of a court official asked neutrally, "your motion was denied. The judge determined that there was not enough evidence to halt the process." Jason felt a knot form in his stomach. "But I have evidence. The bank forged my mother's signature, and the notary didn't even have a valid license." The official sighed, as if he had heard it all before. "If you wish to appeal, you must submit a formal request and attend a hearing on Friday." Jason hung up without replying. He knew he couldn't waste time complaining. If he wanted to win, he needed more than just evidence. He needed allies. Jason ran his hands over his face, trying to calm the storm inside him. The judge hadn't even reviewed the evidence. He already knew that fighting alone would be difficult, but seeing his motion rejected without solid justification only fueled his rage. He needed a different strategy. If the system was against him, then he would resort to the only weapon he still had, exposure. He recalled an article he had read months ago about real estate fraud and illegal foreclosures. The journalist's name flashed in his mind like a lightning bolt: Sofia Alvarez. Without wasting time, Jason grabbed his cell phone and searched for her contact. He found a professional email address on the newspaper's website where she worked. His first impulse was to send a short message, but he knew he had to convince her that his story was worth covering. So he wrote down every detail, attached the evidence he had, and ended with a sincere plea. I know this fight is uneven, but I cannot give up. My mother is sick, and we are being deceived by a bank that has done this to many other families. You are my last hope to bring this to light. He hesitated for a moment before pressing send. Now, all that was left was to hope that someone would finally listen. The day dragged on. Jason checked his email every few minutes, but nothing came. Uncertainty was eroding his patience. He tried to focus on the books, reviewing every point of the foreclosure law, but the words jumbled in his mind. The accumulated fatigue from sleepless nights was starting to take its toll. At the end of the afternoon, when he was nearly ready to give up waiting, his phone vibrated with a new email notification. It was from Sofia Alvarez. Jason opened the message with trembling fingers. Your case is concerning. Can I meet you tomorrow morning to discuss the details? He exhaled a long-held breath without realizing it. It was a small breakthrough, but it was the first sign that someone was willing to listen. He replied quickly, arranging a time and place for the meeting. When he closed the laptop, he felt, for the first time, a flicker of hope. If he could draw attention to what was happening, there might be a real chance to change the game. The next morning, Jason woke up before his alarm. Anxiety gnawed at his stomach, but he ignored the feeling and prepared for his meeting with Sofia. He put on the best shirt he had, wrinkled but clean, and left home carrying a folder with all the documents he had collected. The cafe where they had arranged to meet was only a few blocks away. He arrived a few minutes early and chose a table in the corner where he could observe the entrance. His foot bounced impatiently under the table when finally a brown-haired woman with sharp eyes entered the cafe, holding a notepad. Sofia introduced herself briefly, asking for a coffee before sitting down. I read your email and looked over the documents you sent, she said, as she pulled a pen from her pocket. This looks very serious. Jason nodded, trying to contain his hope. It's serious. My mother paid the mortgage, but the bank is claiming she didn't. And when I went to investigate, I discovered a forged signature and a notary without a valid license. Sofia narrowed her eyes. If this is true, it's not just an administrative error, it's deliberate fraud. Jason slid the papers across the table. I need your help. I need the world to see what's happening. Sofia examined the documents carefully, scribbling notes in her notepad as she flipped through the pages. Jason watched every reaction, searching for any sign that she might help him. After a few minutes of silence, she sighed and looked up at him. I've seen similar schemes before, but most victims never manage to prove it. You have something rare here, concrete evidence of manipulation. Jason leaned forward. So, what can we do with this? Sofia twirled the pen between her fingers, thoughtful. We need to connect the dots. If they did this to your mother, they probably did it to others as well. Jason nodded, feeling adrenaline course through his veins. So, what's the next step? Sofia gave a small smile. I'm going to investigate. I have sources within the banking sector and the courts. If there's a pattern, I'll find it. Jason felt a momentary relief, but he knew the road ahead would be long. Sofia took her phone and jotted down a number on a napkin. If anything strange happens, call me, and be careful. Powerful banks and lawyers do not like being exposed. Jason took the paper and tucked it into his pocket, feeling that something larger was about to unfold. In the days that followed, Jason delved even deeper into the investigation. Every free minute was spent analyzing old contracts, looking for patterns, and studying similar cases. He discovered that Jefferson First Bank had already been accused of predatory practices before, but had always gotten away with it. What bothered him the most was how quickly certain cases were approved in court. Some cases were dismissed before the defendants even had a chance to defend themselves. Something was wrong, and he needed to understand what it was. Meanwhile, Sofia conducted her own investigation. Jason received occasional messages from her, always short and direct. I found something interesting. Wait for updates. This is going to be huge. The anticipation grew with each message, along with mounting tension. Jason began noticing strange things. A car parked on the other side of the street that always seemed to be there when he left home. Calls from unknown numbers that hung up as soon as he answered. At first, he thought it was paranoia, but when he arrived home and found the door ajar, he knew it wasn't. Jason stopped at the door, his heart pounding. He knew he had locked it when he left. His hands trembled as he slowly pushed the door open, his eyes scanning the room. The sofa was overturned, cabinets left open, drawers pulled out, and papers scattered on the floor. His first instinct was to run to his mother's room. He found Rosa sitting on the bed, clutching a rosary between trembling fingers. "They were here," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jason felt his stomach turn. Whoever had done this wanted to send a clear message. Stop now, or the consequences will be worse. He ran to the living room and began searching through the mess. His documents were there, but the case notes had vanished. His laptop was still on the table, but when he turned it on, he noticed that all the important files had been deleted. Jason felt his anger boil inside him. This wasn't just intimidation, it was sabotage. He grabbed his phone and, with trembling fingers, dialed the number Sophia had given him. She answered on the second ring. "Sophia, they broke into my house. They took my notes, erased my files." The silence on the other end lasted only an instant before she said firmly, "That means we're close to the truth." Jason ran a hand over his face, trying to contain his frustration. He wanted to scream, to smash something, but none of that would solve the situation. Sophia took a deep breath on the other end of the line. "Listen, Jason, this wasn't a simple theft. They want to scare you, to make you stop before you can get something concrete." Jason closed his eyes for a moment. "But I'm not going to stop." There was an unyielding conviction in his voice. He could hear a change in Sophia's tone. "Then we need to act quickly. Meet me tomorrow morning. I'll show you what I've discovered." After hanging up, Jason looked around, feeling the weight of the battle. His mother was still sitting on the bed, her eyes brimming with tears. "They can't take this house from us, son." Jason knelt beside her and held her hand. "They won't, Mom. I promise." But promises weren't enough. He needed a plan, and fast. He took his phone and began jotting down everything he could remember from the lost documents. Every detail could be crucial. He knew that, from this moment on, he was up against adversaries who would do anything to keep him down. But fear no longer had a place inside him. Jason returned to the apartment, his steps echoing down the deserted street as his mind swirled with new ideas and fears. He opened the door slowly, fearful of finding more signs of intrusion, but heavy silence greeted him, mixed with the smell of burnt paper and cold coffee. Sitting at the table, he mentally reassembled the fragments of the lost documents, scribbling notes in an old notebook that had now become his battle diary. Every line he wrote carried a memory of what it meant to fight for justice, and at the same time reminded him of the price he and his mother were willing to pay. Shadows danced on the hallway walls as he fiddled with his computer, trying to recover deleted data and saving every little trace of information he could salvage. The computer hummed with the effort of the recovery processes, and Jason felt urgency pulsate in his chest. At that moment, he wasn't alone, but united with a greater cause, the countless invisible victims of injustice. With every click, every attempt to reconstruct the files, he realized the extent of the sabotage. Someone had planned every step to intimidate him, to show that the system would not forgive the bold. Even in the face of this threat, an unyielding determination grew within him, fueled by the memory of his mother's words and the hopeful gleam he saw in Sophia's eyes. Hours passed as he connected the dots between the missing data and the clues left in the case, realizing that every tiny detail might turn the tide. Jason decided that the next morning he would review the documents again, searching for any discrepancy that might still be hidden among the damaged papers, like a secret map to uncover the fraud. Sophia had asked him to meet again in a safe place, away from prying eyes and cameras that might monitor their movements. With his heart pounding, Jason accepted the invitation and headed to a small cafe on a side street, where the intimate atmosphere allowed for frank, uninterrupted conversation. Upon arrival, he found Sophia already seated, her expression serious, and her eyes alight with the intensity of someone who understood just how dangerous the truth could be. She immediately got down to details. "I found records linking bank employees to suspicious contacts, and I discovered that several foreclosure cases had irregular signatures and stamps," she said, as the two of them pored over a set of printed documents. Every word she spoke carried the weight of a revelation. The corruption scheme extended far beyond Rosa Reed's house, involving powerful names and well-structured schemes to continue exploiting the most vulnerable families. Jason felt a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that this discovery could either be the key to bringing down the system or attract even more enemies determined to silence him. As they talked, the ambient noise of the cafe faded into the background, as if time had suspended and the outside world ceased to exist, leaving only the truth and the fight against it. With a low but firm voice, Sophia emphasized that the next step would be to gather more evidence, including testimonies from other victims, and that he needed to act cautiously to avoid further threats. Jason noted every detail, feeling that every line he penned in his notebook was a step toward a justice that, although distant, was becoming increasingly tangible. The determination in the room was palpable, and in that cafe, as the hours passed and the late afternoon light crept through the windows, both of them understood they were about to transform a personal struggle into a collective battle for truth and the dignity of those long forgotten by the system. Jason left the cafe with a new purpose. What had once been a personal fight was now taking on greater dimensions. He was no longer just trying to save his mother's house. He was out to dismantle a scheme that systematically destroyed lives. The cold air bit at his face as he walked the narrow streets of the neighborhood, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Every step echoed on the empty sidewalk, and every thought was a whirlwind of strategies, risks, and possibilities. He knew he needed to be more cautious. If they had already broken into his house once, they might try again. With Sophia's new documents safely hidden in his backpack, he decided not to go straight home. Instead, he took a longer route, stopping by a public library before heading to an old warehouse that a friend had recommended as a discreet place to store important things. The environment was dark, the smell of dust and old wood permeated the air, but there he hid copies of everything they had gathered so far, a safeguard against the worst. Back at the apartment, he found his mother dozing on the couch, her fingers still clutching the rosary she always carried when she was nervous. Jason felt a pang in his chest. She never said it, but he knew how much it was wearing her down. He knelt beside her and adjusted the blanket on her shoulders. Even asleep, Rosa Reed seemed to bear the weight of decades of silent battles. Jason took a deep breath. There was no room for failure. He went to the room and turned on the computer, accessing once again the files that remained after the break-in. The blue light of the screen illuminated his tired face, but his eyes were filled with determination. He returned to studying similar cases, searching for patterns, trying to understand how banks managed to get away with it so many times. He began drafting a list of questions and strategies for the hearing scheduled on Friday. This time, he wouldn't enter that courtroom as a helpless defendant. He would go in prepared to dismantle every lie. The following morning arrived with an even harsher cold, but Jason barely noticed. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he reviewed every detail before leaving. He had arranged to meet Sophia once more, this time in an improvised office of one of her friends, a small space rented by activists fighting for social justice. When he arrived, he found a small group gathered around a worn wooden table. Sophia greeted him with a nod and introduced the others: volunteer lawyers, community activists, and a woman named Miriam, who, according to Sophia, had lost her home to Jefferson First Bank months earlier under suspicious circumstances. Jason listened intently as Miriam recounted her story. The similarities with his mother's case were disturbing. The forged signature, the eviction notice with inconsistent dates, the bank's lack of response. She held a bundle of papers in trembling hands, but her voice was firm as she said, "I tried to fight, but no one listened to me." Jason pressed his lips together, feeling a mix of anger and urgency. Now they will listen. For the next few hours, the group exchanged information, analyzing every document and every irregularity. Sophia revealed that she had found a pattern. The dubious foreclosures were concentrated in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, and all were presided over by the same judge, Stanley Price. Jason had already suspected that the court was complicit, but seeing it laid out so plainly before him was infuriating. How could a judge allow this to happen repeatedly without raising suspicion? Or worse, was he part of the scheme? The question hung in the air, and no one needed to say it aloud for everyone in the room to feel the weight of the revelation. As they planned their next steps, Sophia suggested finding more victims and collecting their testimonies. "If we can gather enough cases, we can take this to the public prosecutor's office, or even pressure a larger newspaper to expose what's happening." Jason nodded. He knew this might be the only way to tip the scales. If the court was compromised, they would need to take the case beyond the walls of the judicial system. They needed visibility, public pressure, but above all, they needed incontrovertible proof, and Jason was determined to get that proof, no matter the cost. Night fell heavily over Washington, but Jason had no time to rest. His body demanded sleep, his eyelids were heavy, but his mind kept churning. He returned home and immediately locked himself in his room, spreading the newly acquired documents across the bed. He needed to cross-check every piece of information, to find connections, any detail that might help dismantle the scheme. He took a notebook and began jotting down names, dates, and case numbers, scribbling arrows and links between each suspicious case. If Jefferson First Bank was orchestrating mass evictions, then Judge Stanley Price was the keystone that made it all possible. Jason spent hours analyzing judicial decisions signed by Price. He noticed that the bank's foreclosure cases were handled in an expedited manner without thorough reviews. On several occasions, victims didn't even have the chance to contest. It was a vicious cycle. The bank fabricated the debt, the court accelerated the eviction, and the families were left with no alternatives. Indignation surged through him like an electric current. He knew that only a public scandal could force change. But before taking the story to the press, he needed definitive proof, something irrefutable. That was when he had a bold idea. If Thomas Granger, the bank's chief lawyer, was one of the architects of this fraud, he could be induced to confess. But how? Jason recalled an article he had read recently about undercover recordings in journalistic investigations. If he could capture a recorded confession from Granger admitting the manipulation of the processes, it might not only save his mother's house, but expose the entire corruption network. It was a risky plan, but he had no choice. He grabbed his phone and called Sophia. "We need to catch Granger in the act," he said bluntly. On the other end, Sophia fell silent for a few seconds before replying, "This could be dangerous, but if done right, it could be the final blow." The next morning, Jason and Sophia met in a secluded parking lot where they discussed the details of the plan. The idea was simple yet daring. Jason would pretend he was willing to give up the fight. He would present himself as a desperate young man with no way out, ready to negotiate to avoid further damage. If he could convince Granger that he was defeated, maybe the lawyer would let his guard down and say too much. Sophia procured a discreet recorder, small enough to be hidden under clothing. Jason tested the device, listening to his own voice played back clearly. He took a deep breath. He wasn't a lawyer nor a journalist, but at that moment he felt like an investigator on the verge of dismantling a criminal network. Hours later, he headed to the Wallace and Granger office, an imposing building in the city center with glass reflecting the gray sky. Upon entering, he was greeted by a receptionist who gave him an indifferent look before directing him to the waiting room. Jason took a deep breath. The recorder was already on. Every second spent there was risky, but he needed to remain calm. A few minutes later, a glass door opened and a tall man in an impeccable suit with a calculating gaze appeared. Thomas Granger. "Mr. Reed," he said with a condescending smile. "What a surprise to see you here." Jason forced a hesitant smile. "I just wanted to talk about a possible resolution to my case." Granger narrowed his eyes, clearly intrigued. "Interesting. Let's go to my office." Jason followed the man, trying to ignore the adrenaline coursing through his veins. If everything went well, that moment would change everything. Jason followed Thomas Granger to a luxurious office at the top of the building. The environment was immaculate, decorated with leather furniture and bookshelves filled with neatly aligned legal volumes. The aroma of strong coffee mixed with the woody scent exuded authority and control. Jason sat in a high-backed chair, trying to appear uncomfortable, as if he were truly defeated. Granger, on the other hand, settled in with the confidence of a man used to crushing opponents effortlessly. "So, Reed," Granger began, crossing his arms over the table, "what exactly do you want to discuss?" Jason took a deep breath, subtly adjusting the position of the recorder hidden under his shirt. "Look, I've tried to fight," he said, feigning hesitation, "but it's clear that I stand no chance against you. My mother can't go through this anymore. I just want to find a way to resolve this without her losing the house." Granger smiled thinly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, you finally understand how things work." Jason maintained a downcast expression, though inside his heart was pounding. "Yes, and I'm willing to listen to your terms. Just tell me what needs to be done." Granger leaned back in his chair, studying him with interest. "You know, Reed, this fight is only happening because you insist on complicating things. People like your mother lose their houses every day, and no one lifts a finger. But you decided to fight." Jason felt his anger rise, but forced a wry smile. "It was a mistake, I admit. I just want to know if there's any way to avoid the eviction without needing more lawyers or courtrooms." Granger let out a short laugh and shook his head. "Of course there is, but for that, you need to agree to sign a confidentiality agreement and forget about this ridiculous investigation." Jason feigned hesitation. "And if I agree, does my mother get to keep the house?" The lawyer picked up a cigar from the desk and twirled it between his fingers. "Let's say we could make an adjustment in your case, but in the end, that's the rule of the game, Reed. The weak lose, the strong win." A chill ran down Jason's spine. He knew he was close to getting what he needed, but he had to press a bit further. "I understand," he said slowly, as if carefully weighing his words. "So in the end, all this is just a matter of manipulating the system?" Granger laughed as if he found the question naive. "Manipulate?" He shook his head and gestured toward the bookshelves. "The system was made to be manipulated. We just use the rules to our advantage." Jason nodded, silently hoping the recorder was capturing everything clearly. "And how exactly does that work? I mean, if there's a way to ensure that certain decisions go in your favor." Granger smiled, clearly pleased with what he assumed was a defeated young man willing to play the power game. "Let's just say there are certain procedural shortcuts. If a judge has the right mindset, they can ensure that certain cases are given the appropriate priority. Or rather, that they're finalized without further complications." Jason knew this was the confession he needed: a friendly judge, a controlled process, an entire scheme of evictions targeted at people without the means to defend themselves. He felt the adrenaline rising, but kept his composure. "And how can I be sure that the agreement will actually happen?" Granger shrugged, as if the question were trivial. "You can't. But you can trust that if you do what's necessary and sign whatever is required, all of this will vanish. If you insist on fighting, you'll end up like all the others." Jason forced a nervous laugh. "And how did all the others end up?" Granger rested his elbows on the table and looked directly at him. "Without a home, without money, and without options." The silence that followed was heavy. Jason felt a lump in his throat, but maintained a neutral expression. He already had what he needed. Now, he just had to leave without raising suspicion. Jason maintained a relaxed posture, pretending to consider the proposal. "All right," he said, trying to sound resigned. "I guess it makes sense. But I need some time to process all of this before signing anything." Granger nodded with a smug smile. "Of course, just don't take too long. The court isn't going to wait to execute the eviction." Jason suppressed the urge to roll his eyes. Their haste only confirmed what he already knew. This scheme was bigger than he had imagined, and the longer he resisted, the riskier it became for them. He stood up, extended his hand, and shook Granger's with controlled firmness. "I appreciate your consideration." Granger shook his hand firmly, his expression suggesting he already considered himself victorious. "Good decision, Reed. I hope you've learned your lesson." Jason left the office with firm steps, but as soon as he crossed the glass doors of the building, he let out a long sigh. The recording was there, on the small device hidden under his shirt. His hands were sweaty, and his heart beat so strongly he could feel the pulse in his throat. He hurriedly walked, weaving between pedestrians, avoiding any suspicious glances. He grabbed his phone and sent a message to Sophia. "I did it." There was no time for celebration. He needed to meet her as soon as possible to ensure that the file was saved in multiple places. With the level of power and influence that Jefferson First Bank and Wallace and Granger wielded, he knew they were willing to do anything to silence him. Sophia was already waiting for him at a discreet cafe, the same place where they had first met. When Jason arrived, she immediately noticed his heavy expression. "You actually did it?" she asked in a low tone, leaning over the table. Jason connected his earphones to his phone and slid the recorder over to her. "Listen for yourself." Sophia pressed play, and as Granger's words echoed from the small device, her eyes widened. "My God," she murmured, placing a hand to her mouth. "This is more than enough to sink them." Jason folded his arms. "Now we need to ensure this recording doesn't disappear." They spent the next half hour transferring the file to various locations, to the cloud, onto flash drives, and even sending it to a trusted contact of Sophia's at a major newspaper. "If something happens to me," Jason said, looking at her seriously, "make sure this gets out." Sophia nodded, her face etched with pure concern. "We won't let anything happen to you, but you need to be aware that now there's no turning back. They will realize you've deceived them. And when that happens, they'll come after you with everything they've got." Jason exhaled deeply. He knew it, but he also knew that at that moment, he was closer than ever to toppling the scheme. That night, Jason barely closed his eyes. The weight of what he had just accomplished was immense, but the danger surrounding him was even greater. He knew that at some point Granger would realize he'd been recorded, and when that happened, their retaliation would be relentless. As he lay on the worn-out mattress in his room, his mind raced. What would come next? The recording was a powerful piece of evidence, but on its own, perhaps it wouldn't be enough to dismantle the entire corruption network. He needed to ensure that the investigation would be expanded, that every piece of the puzzle would connect. What was still missing? He remembered Judge Stanley Price. If the bank was orchestrating evictions and Granger had admitted they had procedural shortcuts, that meant the judge was part of the scheme. But concrete evidence was needed. In the morning, Jason called Sophia and explained his new line of thought. "If we can directly tie Price to the bank, that will be the final explosion." On the other end, Sophia exhaled audibly. "You're right, but getting that proof won't be easy." Judges don't leave obvious trails. Jason had expected that answer. What if we find out if he has any financial involvement with Jefferson First Bank? Bank accounts, transactions, anything that shows a conflict of interest? Sophia fell silent for a moment. That might work. I know someone who can help with that. But you have to be careful, Jason. At this point, they're probably monitoring your every move. He knew it was true, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. They needed to act before the bank reorganized and erased any evidence. Sophia got in touch with a reliable source, a former financial sector employee who now investigated corporate fraud. His name was David Carter, and he had a track record of exposing illicit schemes in large corporations. Jason and Sophia arranged a discreet meeting with him in an underground parking lot, far from cameras and prying eyes. When they arrived, they found a middle-aged man with gray hair and sunglasses leaning against a black car. "So you're the crazy ones who decided to take on the system," he said with a half smile. Sophia crossed her arms. "We need information about Judge Stanley Price. Any financial ties he has with Jefferson First Bank." David nodded slowly. "It won't be easy, but it's not impossible. Judges are clever. They don't leave obvious traces. But if there's something, I'll find it." He grabbed a small notepad and made a few quick notes. "Give me 48 hours. If Price is dirty, I'll know." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it would become. But there was no other choice. He shook David's hand. "We're counting on you." David gave a side smile. "And I hope you know what you're getting into. These guys don't play around." Jason exchanged a look with Sophia. They knew it, but by that moment, they were too committed to back down. The next 48 hours were a test of patience and tension. Jason tried to maintain a normal routine, but with every passing minute, his anxiety grew. He knew that at any moment Granger might realize he'd been recorded, and when that happened, retaliation would be swift. Meanwhile, he continued reviewing documents, searching for any other procedural flaw that could be used against the bank. Sophia, on her part, kept in touch with David, waiting for any update about Judge Price. The streets seemed more hostile, and the stares from strangers lingered a little longer than usual. Jason began noticing cars parked too long in front of his house. Perhaps it was paranoia, or maybe not. On the second day, Sophia finally received a call from David. His voice, laced with urgency, said, "We have a problem. Stanley Price is in too deep. He has direct financial transactions with Jefferson First Bank. Not in his own name, of course, but in the name of a shell company registered under his wife's name." Jason's heart pounded. "So he's laundering money?" David sighed. "Exactly, and it's not a small amount. The bank paid over $300,000 to that company in the last 5 years as legal consultancies. Consultancies that never took place." Sophia muttered under her breath. "That explains why he always rules in their favor." Jason clenched his fists. Now they had the missing piece. If they could connect these transactions to the pattern of fraudulent evictions, they could dismantle everything. But they knew time was running out. They gathered in a discreet warehouse on the city's outskirts, a safe place where they could plan their next moves without being overheard. Sophia spread the documents out on an improvised table while David explained the details of the transactions. "The trick is simple," he said, pointing to the bank statements. "The bank pays the shell company, which then transfers the money into Price's personal account through fictitious investments. It's classic money laundering." Jason scrutinized the papers. Everything made sense. "If we take this to the public prosecutor's office, Price will be investigated." Sophia nodded. "And without his protection, Jefferson First Bank will be exposed. This could trigger a domino effect." But before they could celebrate, a noise from outside froze everyone. The sound of tires screeching, followed by hurried footsteps. Jason instinctively turned off the light in the room. "I think we're being followed," he whispered. Sophia grabbed her phone and quickly sent a message to an emergency contact. David closed the folder of documents. The sound of a car door opening echoed through the alley. Jason held his breath. They were meddling with powerful forces, and now it was clear that they had attracted unwanted attention. The silence inside the warehouse was suffocating. Jason felt every beat of his heart, as if it were a drum signaling danger. Outside, footsteps echoed down the narrow alley, accompanied by muffled voices. Someone was there, and it wasn't by accident. Sophia held her phone tightly, ready to call for help if needed. David, experienced in tense situations, made a discreet gesture for everyone to remain silent. Jason held his breath, waiting. The creak of the warehouse's metal door was enough to trigger his survival instinct. He quickly peered out the side door. Two men in dark suits stood outside, near a black sedan. They spoke softly, but their posture was menacing. One of them held a cigarette, exhaling smoke slowly as he stared directly at the warehouse entrance. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Those men were not there by chance. They were watching, waiting. After a few minutes, the men got into the car and left. But Jason knew that did not mean they were safe. On the contrary, "They know we're here," Sophia said as she quickly gathered the documents. "We can't meet in this place anymore." David nodded. "We need to move forward before they try to silence us for good." Jason clenched his fists. He felt they were on the verge of uncovering the truth, but the danger was becoming all too real. "Let's get out of here, and we need to do it fast." They split up, each taking different routes to avoid being followed. Jason went to an internet cafe and backed up all the documents on multiple secure servers. If anything happened, he wanted to ensure the information would survive. Meanwhile, Sophia contacted a reporter from a major television network. It was time to make this public. If Jefferson First Bank and Judge Price were manipulating evictions and profiting from it, the world needed to know. But Jason knew that the louder they made this, the more dangerous it would become. There was no turning back now. Jason returned home feeling the weight of every step. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't rest. He locked the door twice and checked every window. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave him, and now he knew it wasn't paranoia. They were truly following him. Rosa Reed was in the kitchen, preparing tea, and she looked at her son with concern as soon as he entered. "You seem different, my son. What's going on?" Jason forced a smile, though the exhaustion and tension were written all over his face. "Nothing, Mom. Just a lot of work." But Rosa wasn't naive. She knew her son too well to believe that. She walked over and took his hands. "Jason, I know you're trying to protect us, but whatever you're doing, please be careful." Jason felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to tell his mother the truth, that he was fighting against a corrupt system, and that he finally had something that might turn the tide. But he knew it would only worry her more. Instead, he just nodded and kissed her forehead. "I promise." Deep down, though, he knew he couldn't guarantee anything. What was about to happen was bigger than him, and the only thing he could do was prepare for whatever came next. The next morning, Sophia called with news that quickened his heartbeat. "The reporter accepted the case. He wants to meet with us today." Jason swallowed hard. This was the turning point they needed. If the story were published by a major outlet, the pressure on the court and the bank would be inevitable. "Where will the meeting be?" he asked. Sophia gave him the address of a discreet hotel in the city center. "He wants to avoid any interference." Jason knew what that meant. The reporter already understood that they were dealing with people willing to do anything to hide the truth. At the scheduled time, Jason and Sophia arrived at the hotel and took the elevator to one of the upper floors, where a middle-aged man in a worn suit with an experienced look was waiting. "I'm Robert Hale, investigative reporter. I've seen many stories like this, but I need to be sure we have solid proof." Jason handed over a flash drive with all the evidence. "You have everything here. The recording, Judge Price's financial documents, the pattern of fraudulent evictions. It's all here." Hale plugged the device into his laptop. As the evidence appeared on the screen, He shook his head in disbelief. "This is bigger than I imagined," he murmured. "If we can publish this, there will be serious repercussions." Jason exchanged a look with Sophia. "That's exactly what we want." Robert Hale adjusted his glasses and continued reviewing the files. Every piece of evidence reinforced the gravity of what they were about to expose. He went through the recording of Granger, admitting that the system was manipulated, then through the financial transactions tied to Judge Stanley Price. "This isn't just corruption," he said, looking seriously at Jason and Sophia. "This is a systemic conspiracy. We're talking about a scheme that may have evicted hundreds, perhaps thousands of families." Jason nodded. He already knew that, but hearing someone as experienced as Hale confirm it made it even more real. The reporter closed his laptop and crossed his arms. "Now, we need to plan the publication. If we release the story all at once, we risk a swift retaliation before it gains enough traction." Sophia leaned forward. "What do you suggest?" Hale stroked his chin before replying. "We do it in 2 phases. First, we publish an initial report raising suspicions about the evictions without naming names. Just enough to attract attention and set the stage. Then, once the public is engaged and the system is pressured, we drop the bomb with all the evidence." Jason considered this for a moment and then nodded. It made sense. If they released everything at once, the powerful could try to bury the story before there was time to react. How long would that take? Hale smiled slyly. "If we do it right, at most a week." The plan was set into motion immediately. That very night, Hale began writing the initial report, gathering general information about the rising evictions and suggesting that something was amiss in the courts. Meanwhile, Jason and Sophia focused on ensuring that every piece of evidence was secure. Jason spent hours making copies of the documents, storing them in various locations, including flash drives hidden at home and password-protected files in the cloud. He knew that from the moment the first story went live, there would be no turning back. On the other side of the city, in the Jefferson First Bank office, Thomas Granger was about to discover he had been recorded. He had received an urgent call from an inside contact at the court, warning that something big was happening. With a strained expression, he picked up his phone and dialed a number. "We have a problem," he said in a harsh tone. "Someone leaked information. I want them found out." On the other end, a calm voice replied, "We're already on it." Granger closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He hadn't gotten this far by letting amateurs ruin his business. And if Jason Reed thought he could take them down with a simple recording, he was about to learn the hard way. The next morning, Robert Hale's first report went live. It was an extensive article published on one of the country's most respected newspaper websites, detailing the alarming rise in evictions and raising suspicions about the court's involvement. Names hadn't yet been revealed, but the message was clear. Something was wrong, and someone was profiting from it. Within hours, the article went viral. Civil rights organizations began sharing the story, and pressure on social media grew rapidly. "This is gaining momentum," Sophia said, looking at her phone as notifications popped up non-stop. Jason felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. They were making progress, but they were also drawing unwanted attention, and he was right to worry. Later that afternoon, while returning home, he noticed something odd. A black car was parked across the street, its windows tinted. He slowed his pace, pretending not to notice, but his instincts screamed that something was off. As soon as he entered the building, he grabbed his phone and called Sophia. "Someone's watching me," he said in a lowered voice. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes, and I think they already know about the story." The silence on the other end was heavy. Finally, Sophia said, "We need to be careful. The next report will expose everything. And when that happens, they'll come down on us hard." Jason took a deep breath. He knew he was meddling with powerful people, but now there was no turning back. Across town, in the Wallace and Granger office, the reaction was already underway. Thomas Granger clutched his phone tightly as he read the report on the newspaper's website. His face flushed with anger. "That kid went too far," he growled, slamming the phone on the desk. Judge Stanley Price, seated across the room, took a swig of whiskey and sighed. "We need to control the narrative before it gets out of hand." Granger rubbed his face with his hands, deep in thought. "We can't just ignore this. The public is already suspicious. If they release the next report with all the evidence, we're finished." Price maintained an impassive expression. "Then perhaps it's time to silence Reed before he goes any further." Granger narrowed his eyes. "What exactly are you suggesting?" The judge twirled his glass between his fingers. "I'm just saying that if he disappears off the radar, the case dies with him." The ensuing silence was dense. Granger walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. He had dealt with obstacles before, but Jason Reed was different. He wasn't just another citizen facing eviction. He was fighting, and worse, he was winning. "If they're going to do that," Granger said, still staring at the city, "make sure it can't be traced back to us." Price smiled, lifting his glass in a silent toast. "Leave that to me." That night, Jason couldn't sleep. He felt something was about to happen. The first report had already made an impact, but it was the second, with all the evidence, that would be the fatal blow to the scheme. The problem was that those responsible also knew this. He spent the night checking the files, ensuring everything was stored in multiple locations. Every piece of evidence, every recording, every document had to be safeguarded. He sent copies to Sophia, Hale, and even to a lawyer who had offered to help if anything went wrong. Yet the restlessness wouldn't let him be at ease. In the morning, as he left home to meet with Sophia and Hale, he noticed something odd. The black car from the previous night was still there. There was no doubt now. He was being followed. Jason took a photo of the vehicle and sent it to Sophia. "They're still here." Seconds later, she replied, "Don't go home. Meet me at a safe place." Jason tucked his phone away and began walking quickly through the streets, his heart pounding. Every corner felt like a trap, every person a potential enemy. He needed to reach Sophia before something happened. On the other side of town, Robert Hale was finishing the second report. The article was explosive. It named Thomas Granger, Judge Stanley Price, and Jefferson First Bank as direct participants in a fraudulent eviction scheme. The recording of Granger admitting that the system was manipulated was the centerpiece of the allegation. As soon as Hale clicked save, his phone rang. "Ready to publish?" It was Sophia's voice. "Almost," he replied. "I need a few more hours to ensure everything is legally bulletproof." But something in Sophia's voice made him alert. "What happened?" she asked hesitantly. "Jason is being followed. Since yesterday." Hale muttered, "That's not good. If they're monitoring him, it means they know something's coming." Sophia took a deep breath. "We need to act quickly." Hale agreed. "I'll advance the publication. If anything happens to us, the story will already be out." He ended the call and began reviewing the final details of the article. The clock was ticking, and now it depended on who acted first, them or the powerful enemies trying to silence them. Jason continued walking through the busy Washington streets, trying to shake off any trace of being followed. He looked into shop windows, using the reflections to check if he was still being watched. The black car was no longer visible, but that didn't mean he was safe. He followed the meeting route he had arranged with Sophia and reached a discreet cafe on the outskirts of the city. He sat in an isolated corner, waiting for her. Nervousness was etched on his face. He needed to ensure that the second report went live before something worse happened. Minutes later, Sophia entered the cafe, scanning the area before sitting next to Jason. "Hale will publish it today," she said, placing a flash drive discreetly on the table. "Here are all the backup copies. If something goes wrong, we need to ensure this gets out to the world." Jason took the device and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket. "If they were following me, it means they already know we're close to taking this down." Sophia nodded, stirring her coffee without actually drinking it. "The question is, What will they do to try to stop us? The answer came sooner than they expected. At the Wallace and Granger office, Thomas Granger received a call that made him jump from his chair. "They're going to publish today?" The voice on the other end confirmed. Granger slammed his hand on the desk in anger. "This can't happen. If this article goes out, price falls and we all go down." The silence on the other end indicated that the caller already knew. "If we want to stop this, we need to act now." Granger took a deep breath, trying to control his tension. Watch over Reed. Make it look like an accident. Meanwhile, Hale was in the newspaper office, finalizing the second report. He knew that as soon as he pressed send, the story would take on a life of its own. The system would try to react, but it was too late to contain it. He typed the final words, reviewed the headline, and finally pressed the publish button. In seconds, the report was live. The final blow had been delivered. In the cafe, Sophia's phone vibrated. She picked it up and looked at Jason with wide eyes. "It's out." Jason grabbed his own phone and opened the newspaper's website. There was the headline, "Fraudulent Eviction Scheme Exposes Corruption in the Court." He felt a lump in his throat. Everything they had fought for was now in the public eye. But before he could celebrate, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A black car had stopped at the corner. His stomach churned. "Sophia, we need to get out of here. Now." Jason and Sophia hurriedly left the cafe, trying to appear natural as they crossed the street. But Jason knew they were being watched. The black car remained parked at the corner, and he could feel someone inside it, tracking every step they took. "Where do we go?" Sophia whispered urgently. Jason scanned the area, trying to decide the best route. "If we go home, we'll be cornered. We need to head to somewhere crowded." They turned a corner and entered a nearby shopping center, blending in with the crowd. Jason pulled Sophia into a side corridor near the emergency stairs. "Are they following us?" he asked. Sophia quickly looked back and nodded. "Two guys, dark suits. They're trying not to look suspicious, but it's obvious they're tailing us." Jason closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think. They couldn't run forever. They needed to find a way to protect themselves, and at the same time, ensure that Hale was informed if something happened. "We have to find Hale," Jason said. "If something happens, he needs to know they're after us." Sophia agreed. "There's a parking lot at the back. We can catch a taxi there." They quickly headed for the side exit of the shopping center, trying to remain unseen as the footsteps behind them grew louder. Across town, Robert Hale was on the phone, dealing with the flood of repercussions from the report. The story had spread like wildfire. In less than an hour, television channels were already commenting on the scandal, and political figures began speaking out. Some called for immediate investigations, others tried to downplay the impact. But one thing was certain: the case had exploded. The public prosecutor announced that they would review all eviction cases overseen by Judge Stanley Price, and Jefferson First Bank released a vague statement claiming it had always followed the laws and regulations of the sector. Hale knew that was only the beginning. "Jason needs to see this," he murmured, picking up his phone to call him. But when he dialed, no one answered. Hale frowned. He tried calling Sophia. Still no answer. His journalist instincts screamed for alert. He looked at his computer screen, where the report still glowed, and felt a shiver run down his spine. Granger and Price wouldn't accept this exposure without a fight, and if Jason and Sophia weren't answering, it meant only one thing: they were in danger. Jason and Sophia arrived at the back parking lot of the shopping center, breathing hard. They had managed to shake off the men in suits, but they knew it wouldn't last long. Jason scanned the area for a taxi or any vehicle that could get them away, but before they could move, the sound of footsteps echoed on the concrete. Two men appeared at the side exit, blocking their path. "Damn," Sophia muttered, instinctively backing away. Jason looked around, calculating his options. The parking lot was spacious but surrounded by high walls. The only exit was through the men who now advanced toward them. The first man, a tall, broad-shouldered individual, stepped forward. "Mr. Reed," he said in a cold, controlled voice, "we need you to come with us." Jason's adrenaline spiked. He knew exactly what this meant. If he got into that car, he probably wouldn't be seen again. Sophia discreetly tried to send a message to Hale with her phone, but the second man noticed. "No sudden moves," he warned, pulling his jacket aside to reveal the handle of a gun. Jason looked at Sophia. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own. They were cornered, but he wasn't going to surrender without a fight. Just when it seemed all was lost, a car screeched into the parking lot at high speed, braking abruptly between Jason and the two men. The passenger door swung open, and a voice shouted, "Get in, now!" Jason recognized the voice before even seeing the face. It was Robert Hale. Without hesitation, he grabbed Sophia and ran to the car, quickly getting inside. The men tried to react, but Hale was already speeding out of the lot before they could even draw their weapons. The car screeched as it exited onto the main avenue, blending into the traffic. Jason looked in the rearview mirror and saw the men falling behind, furious and helpless. "Are you both okay?" Hale asked, not taking his eyes off the road. Sophia was still catching her breath. They were going to get us." Jason nodded, his heart still pounding. "And the report? How's the response?" Hale let out a nervous laugh. "It's out of control. The public prosecutor just announced a formal investigation against Price and Jefferson First Bank. Lawyers are already filing class action lawsuits. This has become a bomb." Jason closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a brief moment of relief. They had done it, but the fight was far from over. As the car sped through the city streets, Jason felt the weight of what they had narrowly escaped. His heart still pounded, but the adrenaline was beginning to give way to profound exhaustion. "Where are we going?" he asked, looking at Hale. The reporter kept his eyes on the road. "To a safe location. I've arranged protection for you both." At this point, Granger and Price know that the story is out and that you are their biggest threat. Jason nodded, processing everything. He had gone from a young man fighting to save his mother's house to someone caught up in a national corruption scandal. But it wasn't time to dwell on that. They needed to survive. Sophia fiddled with her phone, reading the headlines that were multiplying by the minute. "They're already calling it the eviction scandal," she said, not taking her eyes off the screen. "Judge Price has been temporarily removed from duty while the allegations are being investigated. Jefferson First Bank hasn't commented yet, but its shares dropped 15% in just a few hours." Jason exhaled. The first major victory had arrived, but he knew a long road still lay ahead. Granger and his allies wouldn't simply accept defeat. They still had money, connections, and power, but now, for the first time, they were on the defensive. The car stopped in front of a small hotel away from the city center, a discreet and quiet location. Hale turned off the engine and faced Jason and Sophia. "You're going to stay here for a while, at least until the dust settles." Jason looked at the modest building and felt a pang in his chest. He hated the idea of hiding, but he knew it was necessary. "And you?" he asked Hale. The reporter smiled wearily. "I have more work to do. This isn't over yet." They entered the hotel and went up to a modest but secure room. Jason sat on the bed and ran his hands over his face. Sophia sank into the armchair beside him, exhausted. "Did we really do it?" she murmured, as if still trying to believe. Jason looked at her and smiled faintly. "We did, but the fight continues." He picked up his phone and opened his messages. There were dozens of notifications from people who had read the report and wanted to share their stories. Other victims, people who had also been deceived by the system. And in that moment, Jason realized that this was bigger than he had imagined. He had started fighting for his mother, but now he was fighting for something much greater. The following hours were a whirlwind. Messages kept coming. People from all over the country were speaking out, some sharing similar stories, others offering support. Civil rights lawyers began contacting him, ready to represent victims who now saw a chance for justice. Jason felt a lump in his throat. He never imagined his personal fight would transform into a movement. But there he was, receiving messages from entire families who had lost their homes and for the first time believed that something could be done. "Are you seeing this?" Sophia asked, showing a social media post. A group of protesters had gathered in front of the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for eviction victims" and "The system won't silence us." Jason shivered. The story had gotten out of the hands of the powerful. Now, it belonged to the people. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, the impact of the scandal was deepening. The public prosecutor announced that investigations would be opened against Judge Stanley Price and that all foreclosure cases he had overseen in recent years would be re-evaluated. Pressure was mounting. Granger desperately tried to contain the damage, but he knew he was cornered. His phone rang non-stop with calls from worried clients and partners. And when, later that night, federal agents raided the Wallace and Granger office with search warrants, he realized that the empire he had built was crumbling. At the hotel, Jason watched the news coverage on television, still trying to absorb everything. He didn't feel victorious, not yet. He knew there was much more to be done, but for the first time, he felt that the system, however slowly, was being forced to address those it had always ignored. Sophia sat next to him. And now, what comes next? Jason thought for a moment. He could finally rest, return to his life, and try to rebuild everything he'd lost. But he knew he couldn't simply ignore what he had learned. He had seen the system's flaws up close, and now he had something valuable: knowledge. "I can't stop," he said, looking at the TV screen where images of Judge Price being led in for questioning were shown. "This isn't just about me or my mother. It's about everyone who has been through this and never had a voice." Sophia smiled, shaking her head. "So, you're going to continue?" Jason took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes. I'm going back to study law. I'm going to become a lawyer." He had never thought he'd return to university after dropping out to care for his mother. But now, he saw a greater purpose. What began as a fight to save his home had transformed into a war against a broken system. He wanted to ensure that no one else would have to go through what his mother had experienced, and with that, he realized something. Sometimes the battles we choose to fight aren't just about us. They're about everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. The following days were a mix of chaos and change. Headlines continued dominating the news, and public pressure increased. Protests filled the courthouse steps, demanding justice for all families affected by the fraudulent eviction scheme. In a press conference, the public prosecutor announced that Jefferson First Bank was officially under federal investigation and that Judge Stanley Price had been removed from his position while the allegations against him were reviewed. The system, which for so long had operated in the shadows, was being forced to answer for its actions. Yet not everything was cause for celebration. Jason knew that the consequences were far from over. He and Sophia had to remain under protection for a while, as threats still lingered. Granger and his allies were under investigation, but that didn't mean they would give up without a fight. Still, Jason felt that he had achieved something greater than any individual victory. He had proven that a corrupt system could be challenged. That truth, even when they tried to silence it, could find a way to emerge. And more than that, he realized that power wasn't solely in the hands of the rich and influential, but also in those willing to challenge injustice. A week later, a new letter arrived in the mail. It was from the University of Georgia regarding the law program he had applied to. Jason held the envelope for a moment, feeling the irony of the moment. Before, he had dropped out of college because he had to protect his mother. Now he was returning, but for an even greater reason: to protect people like her. He opened the letter with trembling hands, and upon reading the first words, "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted," he felt a wave of emotion rush through him. He looked at Rosa Reed, whose eyes were filled with pride and tears. "Your father would be so proud," she said. Jason smiled, holding her hand. "I'm going to do it for him, and for you." The fight wasn't over. He knew that the road to true justice was long and filled with obstacles, but now he wasn't alone. He had allies, he had support, and above all, he had a purpose. As he watched the protests on TV and saw the faces of people who had been harmed by the system, Jason felt a new kind of certainty growing inside him. The battle that had begun as a desperate attempt to save his home had transformed into something much larger, and he was ready to keep fighting. On the day of the first formal hearing against Jefferson First Bank, Jason sat in the front row of the courtroom, watching as the defense lawyers tried to argue against the overwhelming evidence. For the first time, the powerful were on the other side of the table, forced to justify themselves before justice. Hale and Sophia sat by his side, and among the audience, he recognized several of the eviction victims, people who had lost everything, but who now had a chance to fight. The judge presiding over the case wasn't Price. He had resigned days earlier, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew it was an attempt to avoid an even bigger condemnation. Jason closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had started this fight as a desperate student trying to save his home. Now he was there as someone who helped change the course of an entire system. As he left the courtroom, he saw a crowd gathered outside, holding signs and chanting slogans. As he walked among them, some people recognized him and came over to shake his hand. "Thank you for not giving up," said an older man whose family had been evicted years before. Jason simply nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the strength of what they had built. He stepped away from the crowd, picked up his phone, and checked his email. Among the many new messages, one caught his attention. "Welcome to law school. Ready for your new journey?" He smiled, tucking the phone into his pocket. Yes, he was ready. And this time, he wouldn't be fighting just for his mother. He would fight for everyone the system tried to silence.